By the end of this night, I finally remembered why I started walking at 2:17. And once I remembered, I understood why stopping scared them more than anything I'd done before. Because I wasn't being watched to protect them. I was being watched to make sure I never remembered. So let me ask you something. If forgetting was the only thing keeping people calm, what happens the moment you start remembering? And to understand why this couldn't stay buried any longer, we need to go back to the one night I promised myself I'd never think about again.
I didn't remember it all at once. It came back in pieces. Not images, not sounds, feelings. The kind that sit in your chest long before your brain catches up. I was sitting at the kitchen table when it started. The house was quiet again, but not the peaceful kind. The kind that feels like it's holding its breath. My phone was face down in front of me. I hadn't touched it in hours. I was afraid that if I did, someone would respond. That's when the thought hit me, not as a question, as a realization. I hadn't started walking at 2:17 because I wanted to. I had started walking because I needed to. My hands tightened around the edge of the table as something shifted in my head. A memory brushed past, then disappeared again, like my mind was testing whether it was safe to keep going. Outside, a car door closed softly, not slammed, placed carefully. I stood and walked to the window, slow enough not to draw attention. The police cruiser was still there, a different one this time. Same spot, same angle, same routine. They weren't guarding the house, they were maintaining the pattern. That's when I understood the part that hadn't made sense before. They didn't care where I walked. They cared that I walked. My phone vibrated. One notification. No sound. A message from the same unknown number. You're closer than you think. I didn't reply. I didn't need to, because the memory was pushing harder now, no longer asking permission. I remembered standing in the street weeks ago, staring at my front door, knowing I couldn't stay inside, not because I was in danger, because someone else was. The air in the kitchen felt thick, like the room had shrunk around me. I sat back down, heart racing, and pressed my palms flat against the table. Think. Slow. Whatever I'd been trying to forget had rules. Rules I'd followed without understanding them. Walk at the same time. Take the same route. Don't talk to anyone. Don't stop. And most importantly, don't remember why. My phone buzzed again. Another message. They're going to ask you questions tonight. I looked toward the window. The cruiser hadn't moved. How do you know? I typed. The reply came instantly. Because this is the night you broke it. I stared at the screen. I didn't do anything, I typed back. That's the problem. You didn't do what you were supposed to. A memory finally clicked into place. Not a full scene, just a sentence I'd said to myself. If I stop walking, they'll start asking questions. Not who would ask, what. Questions don't scare people. Answers do. I stood up again, pacing slowly, keeping my movements small. My reflection in the dark window looked unfamiliar, like I was watching someone else try to solve my life. Another car pulled up outside, then another. No sirens, no urgency, just presence. My phone buzzed once more. This is where it usually resets, the man wrote. You walk, they relax, everyone goes back to sleep. And if I don't, I typed. The dots appeared, paused, then disappeared. Finally, the reply came. Then you remember the part you buried for a reason. A knock came to the door. Firm, measured, the kind of isn't asking. I didn't move. Another knock. Sir, we just need to talk, a voice called out, calm and professional. I felt the memory settle fully into place then, heavy and unavoidable. I hadn't started walking because I was confused. I had started walking because staying still was dangerous. Not for me, for them. I looked at my phone one last time. No new messages, just the lock screen staring back at me. 2:17 a.m. The knock came again, louder now. And as I took a breath and stepped toward the door, I understood the truth that changed everything. I hadn't been trying to escape being watched. I had been giving them time.
I opened the door before they knocked again. Not because I was ready, because delaying it was starting to feel like breaking another rule I didn't remember agreeing to. 2 officers stood on the porch, different faces than before, same calm, same distance, same look that said this wasn't their first time here, even if it was the first time we'd met. "Good evening," one of them said. He checked his watch without meaning to. Or morning, I guess. Neither of them smiled. "We just want to ask you a few questions," the other added. "Nothing formal." Nothing formal meant everything mattered. I stepped aside and let them in. They didn't look around this time. No scanning, no curiosity. They already knew the layout, or at least they acted like they did. They stood near the orange wall, hands folded, bodies angled toward me, like this was a conversation they'd rehearsed. "Do you remember why you started walking at night?" the first one asked. The question landed heavier than it should have, because it wasn't "have you been walking," it was "why." "I didn't," I said carefully, "not until tonight." The second officer nodded slowly. "And now?" I hesitated. The memory was still fragile, like if I said it out loud, it might change shape. "I remember being afraid to stay inside," I said. "I remember thinking if I stayed, something would happen." "To you?" he asked. "No," I said. "That's the part I didn't understand before." They exchanged a glance. The first officer leaned slightly closer. "Who were you afraid for?" I opened my mouth and realized I didn't know how to explain it without sounding insane. "I don't remember a face," I said, "or a name, just the certainty." They waited, so I continued. "I remember knowing that me being visible mattered, that being seen kept something predictable." "Predictable for who?" the second officer asked. I felt my pulse in my ears. "Everyone," I said. Silence filled the room. Then the first officer nodded once, like that was the answer he'd been expecting. "That's consistent," he said. "With what?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he asked another question. "Do you remember what happened the night before you started walking?" My stomach tightened. I looked past them, toward the hallway, like the memory might be hiding there. "I remember a noise," I said slowly. "Not loud, out of place." The second officer's posture shifted, just a little. "Inside the house?" he asked. "Yes." Another pause. "And what did you do?" the first officer asked. I swallowed. "I stayed still," I said. "I didn't want whoever it was to know I was awake." The room felt colder. "Did you call anyone?" he asked. "No." "Why not?" "Because something inside me had told me not to. Because calling someone would make it real. Because once it was real, I wouldn't be able to forget it again." "I didn't want witnesses," I said before I could stop myself. The second officer exhaled quietly through his nose. "That's where things usually split." "Split how?" I asked. "Some people remember everything," he said. "Others just remember enough to function." I stared at him. "What are you talking about?" The first officer stepped in. "You weren't walking to protect yourself," he said calmly. "You were walking to anchor a version of reality." I laughed once, sharp, uncontrolled. "That doesn't make sense." "It doesn't have to," he replied. "It just has to work." My phone vibrated on the table. All 3 of us looked at it. A message from the same number. "You're saying too much." The officers didn't react, which told me everything. "You know who that is," I said. The first officer met my eyes. "We know what role he plays." "And mine?" I asked. He glanced at his partner, then back at me. "You walk. People sleep. Patterns hold." "And if I stop?" I asked. The second officer answered this time. "Then whatever you noticed that night," he said, quietly, "has no reason to stay hidden." The weight of the memory pressed harder. I remembered standing in the dark, holding my breath, knowing that if I moved, it would move too. That's when it finally hit me. Walking wasn't the solution. Walking was the distraction. I looked at the door, then back at them. "So what happens now?" I asked. They stepped toward the door together. "We wait," the first officer said. "For what?" He paused with his hand on the knob. "For you to decide," he said, "whether remembering is worth what comes back with it." The door closed behind them. The house was quiet again, but this time the quiet wasn't holding its breath. It was listening.
I didn't sleep after they left. Not because I was afraid something would happen, because I was afraid something already had. The house made sounds it always had, pipes, settling wood, the distant hum of the refrigerator. But now each one felt like it was asking a question I didn't want to answer. I sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, phone in my hand, watching the time change minute by minute. 2:41, 2:42, 2:43. Every part of me wanted to lie down, to shut my eyes and let whatever had been holding things together take over again. But I didn't, because I could feel it now. The memory wasn't gone. It was pacing. I stood and walked slowly down the hallway, stopping in front of the spare room. The door was closed. It always was. I don't remember deciding to open it. I just remember my hand already on the knob. Inside, the room looked normal. Too normal. Neatly made bed, nothing out of place, no signs of panic. And that was the problem. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The air felt different in here, heavier, like the room remembered something the rest of the house had agreed to forget. I sat on the bed and tried to focus, not on images, on sensations. The memory came back sideways. I remembered standing right here weeks ago, barefoot on the floor, listening to someone breathe. Not loudly, carefully, as if they were trying to match the house. My pulse spiked. I remembered realizing something worse than being watched. I remembered realizing I wasn't alone, but I wasn't the one in danger. Someone else was hiding, and whoever was outside the house that night wasn't looking for me. The thought made my stomach turn. I remembered the decision then, the moment everything changed. If I stayed inside, whatever was hiding had nowhere to go. If I left the house, I gave it space. I stood up too fast, heart pounding. "That's why," I whispered to the empty room. Walking wasn't about being seen. It was about drawing attention away, keeping eyes on me, keeping patrols predictable, keeping everyone looking outward instead of inward. My phone vibrated in my hand. A new message. "You're not supposed to remember this part yet." I stared at the screen. "Was someone in my house?" I typed. The reply took longer this time. "Yes." My throat tightened. "Who?" I typed. 3 dots appeared, stopped, appeared again. Finally, someone who shouldn't have been. I sat back down, the weight of it pressing into my chest. "Did I help them?" I asked. Another pause. "You helped everyone," he replied. "That was the problem." I thought about the officers, the neighbors, the way everyone reacted when I stopped walking. They weren't afraid of me. They were afraid of what would happen without me. "You turned me into a routine," I typed. "You volunteered," he replied. "No, I adapted." That felt closer to the truth. I looked around the room again, noticing details I'd never paid attention to before. The window latch, the slight gap in the frame, the way the curtain didn't quite reach the floor. Someone had stood here, watched, waited. I stood and stepped back into the hallway, closing the door behind me. The house felt exposed now, like remembering had changed its shape.
My phone buzzed one last time. "If you keep going," the message read, "you won't be able to walk it away anymore." I looked at the clock. 3:02 a.m. For the first time since this started, the time didn't matter. Because the truth was finally clear. Walking had never been about escape. It had been about containment. And now that I remembered what I'd been containing, I wasn't sure the routine would work anymore.
The sun was starting to rise when I heard the knock again. Not loud, not urgent. Careful. The kind of knock that assumes you're already awake. I didn't check the clock. I didn't need to. Time had stopped meaning what it used to. I walked to the front door slowly, listening to my own footsteps like they belonged to someone else. Through the peephole, I saw the same officer from the night before, alone this time. I opened the door. "You remembered," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied. He nodded, like that confirmed something he'd been waiting on. "Then we should talk before you decide what to do next." I stepped aside and let him in. He didn't go near the orange wall this time. He stayed closer to the door, like he didn't want to be inside any longer than necessary. "They were never looking for you," he said. "Not that night, not any night." "I know," I said. He studied my face carefully. "Do you know who they were looking for?" "No," I said, "but I know what I did." I told him about the spare room, about the breathing, about the decision to leave the house so whatever was inside could move without being seen. I didn't embellish. I didn't soften it. When I finished, he exhaled slowly. "That's why your walking mattered," he said. "It gave us a fixed point." "Us?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. "People who needed things to stay predictable," he said finally, "because unpredictability makes panic spread faster than facts." "And the person in my house?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "Never identified," he said. "Never found." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything else he'd said. "You knew this would come back," I said. "Yes," he replied. "That's why we let you forget." The word "let" landed hard. "You didn't erase anything," he continued. "You buried it yourself. Forgetting was the only way you could keep walking." I leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. "And now?" I asked. He looked toward the window, where neighbors were starting their mornings, doors opening, cars starting, normal life resuming. "Now the question is whether you want to remember or whether you want things to keep working." "What happens if I remember everything?" I asked. He met my eyes. "Then you stop being useful," he said, "and usefulness is what kept everyone calm." I laughed quietly. "That's it? I walk so people can sleep?" He didn't smile. "You walked so something worse wouldn't," he said. I felt the weight of that settle into my chest. "And if I stop now?" I asked. He took a step back toward the door. "Then we lose the routine," he said, "and routines are the only things standing between uncertainty and fear." He paused, hand on the knob. "You should know," he added, "this wasn't a mistake. You were very good at it." The door closed behind him. I stood alone in the quiet house, the memory fully awake now. Someone had been inside my home. They'd used the moment I stayed still, and I'd chosen to walk so the world would keep looking at me instead. My phone buzzed one last time. No number, just text. "You don't have to keep doing this." I stared at the message, because for the first time, that was true. But stopping didn't feel like freedom. It felt like opening the door to something I'd spent weeks making sure stayed unseen. I walked to the spare room again and stood outside the door. I didn't open it. Not yet. Some choices don't need time. They need silence. And as the house filled with morning light, I realized this wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment everything depended on what I chose to remember next.
I stood there longer than I expected to, outside the spare room, hand near the door, listening to nothing. That was the strange part. There was no sound anymore, no breathing, no movement, no sense that anything was waiting on the other side. The house felt ordinary again. Not safe, just ordinary. I realized then that whatever had been inside my home that night wasn't there anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Walking hadn't kept it trapped. Walking had given it time to leave, time to disappear, time to become someone else's problem. That's why no one ever came back for it. That's why no one pushed harder once the routine started, because the danger had already passed. What remained was the usefulness of the pattern. I lowered my hand. I didn't open the door. There was nothing left inside that room except a version of myself that believed staying still was worse than being seen. I walked back to the living room and sat down as morning fully arrived. Neighbors passed outside. Cars drove by. Life continued without needing anything from me. My phone stayed silent. No messages, no reminders, no expectations. For the first time since this started, no one needed me to be predictable. And that's when I understood the final truth. They weren't watching me anymore. They were watching the absence of me, waiting to see if I'd return to the routine, waiting to see if the world still needed a distraction. I didn't go out that night, or the next. Nothing happened. No sirens. No whispers, no panic. The pattern faded the way all things do when people stop paying attention, and slowly, so did I. I still think about that night sometimes, about the choice I made without understanding it, about how easy it is for an ordinary person to become a solution to a problem no one wants to explain. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Being watched isn't always about suspicion. Sometimes it's about relief. Because as long as someone is visible, everyone else can pretend nothing is wrong. I don't walk anymore. But every now and then, at 2:17 in the morning, I wake up anyway. Not because I'm afraid, but because part of me still wonders, what would have happened if I hadn't left the house that night? Final CTA. End of voiceover. If you watched this from the beginning, thank you. And if this story made you uncomfortable, that was the point. Because the most unsettling stories aren't about monsters. They're about how quietly people agree to look away. If you want more stories like this, subscribe. The next one won't start at 2:17, but it will start somewhere familiar. If you want next, I can